When Congress defunded public media, thousands of you stepped up, increasing your monthly gift to help us survive year one without federal funding. We made it, but that loss isn't going away. So if you haven't increased your monthly contribution yet, now's the time. And if you're not a sustaining member, join us. A monthly gift to Boise State Public Radio gives us the steady, reliable support we need for year two and beyond. Choose the support tab at boisestatepublicradio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. This is when we get you up to date on the news that made headlines this last week. And today, our panel includes George Prentice with Boise State Public Radio, Lisa Leet with EastIdahoNews.com, and later we will have Lauren Patterson, reporter and host for Boise State Public Radio, and Nicole Blanchard, Idaho Statesman's outdoors reporter. But first, we are starting with our very own George Prentice. George, hi, nice to have you back on the show.
Thanks for the invite, Gemma.
So, George, let's talk about this year's Oregon-Idaho United Methodist Conference, because it ended with a pretty close vote to move next year's gathering out of Idaho. And apparently this is sparking a bigger conversation around things like safety and what it means to stand with vulnerable communities. So, George, tell us about this story that reports that Idaho is about to lose. I mean, this is a major religious conference, and some people may not know that.
Indeed, there are tens of thousands of official members of the United Methodist Church in Idaho. Just in southern Idaho, we're talking about 41 churches that stretch across the Magic and Treasure Valley, and then they stretch into eastern Oregon. The district all in includes 100 churches. And as you noted, the United Methodist Church has voted to not hold its annual Oregon/Idaho conference here in Idaho. They usually meet at the Cathedral of the Rockies, but last month there was a motion to not hold their conference in Idaho because those who don't want it here said they don't feel safe here. They pointed to new legislation coming out of the Idaho State House, policies that they say target the LGBTQ plus population. Also, they pointed to anti-immigration measures that some Idaho lawmakers tried to pass earlier this year. And now, by the way, all of this coming from reporting from FAVS News Service, which partners with our colleagues at Northwest Public Broadcasting and Spokane Public Radio. So here we are, and it was a close vote, but they say they don't feel as if it's a proper representation here in Idaho.
So, George, it's our understanding this was a pretty emotional vote. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, and a very close one. 52% supported the motion not to hold next year's conference in Idaho. Specifically, that means 99 voted to keep it out of Idaho next year. 90 voted to stay. I'm going to read just part of a letter that has been sent to all of the churches in the district. We know this was a close vote, so let me read this here. Quote, "We take seriously the concerns about safety and the potential for harm raised by people of color, immigrants, and queer and trans siblings." This is a pretty big deal.
It really is, George. So how are some Idaho Methodist faith leaders reacting to this news?
Well, you may remember a few years ago, actually on this broadcast, my conversation with Bishop Cedric Bridgeforth, who leads the Greater Northwest Episcopal area of the United Methodist Church. He says the conference isn't divided as much as the fact that this vote responds because of their obligations to different vulnerable groups. Quote, "It's not an Idaho versus Oregon thing. It's how do we protect those that need to be protected?" And he said, again quoting here, "For some, it's too dangerous, and that's the hard truth. But some of us are called to serve in Idaho." So, it was a really close vote, and but it opens up a much bigger conversation.
Yeah, it really does. So, George, I want to move on to another story that's really been making headlines. Can you remind us quickly of the circumstances surrounding the brutal killing of Jordan Harpst on the Boise Greenbelt earlier this month?
Yeah, the morning of July 6th that the body of 25-year-old Jordan Harbst was discovered. You may recall he had been riding an electric scooter down the Greenbelt, but he was attacked and stabbed multiple times, and he died. Boise police asked the public for help in their investigation. It wasn't long before they arrested Ross Wardlaw. He was arrested, by the way, at Corpus Commons shelter in Boise, a day shelter for the homeless. We quickly learned that Wardlaw had been homeless for some time, and we also learned that Wardlaw had a criminal record. He had been arrested previously and charged with battery and or assault. By the way, it turns out that Wardlaw had actually checked himself into Intermountain Hospital for mental health treatment earlier this month. So there were a lot of layers to this. That, as Wardlaw is behind bars and the family of Jordan Harbst is grieving.
And in the midst of all of this, George, this story has become political this week. So tell us about the public debate between a couple of Idaho legislators and Boise Mayor Lauren McLean.
Yeah, House Speaker Mike Moyle and GOP House Representative Bruce Skog issued a press release saying they were, quoting here, furious, insisting that the stabbing death of Mr. Harbst could have been prevented. They said if Boise had done a better job enforcing Idaho's anti-camping law, again, they said the murder could have been prevented. Kudos, by the way, to BoiseDev.com for doing a deep dive to learn that in the past 12 months, Boise police have issued no fewer than 112 tickets for camping, enforcing that anti-camping law, and more than 50 homeless camps had been cleaned up in the past 12 months. So earlier this week, I spoke to Boise Mayor Lauren McLean, who said Moyle and Skog couldn't have been more wrong. Let's take a listen.
How could anybody expect something like this to become political? There's a family that is hurting, a community that is reeling, and we need real solutions.
So, George, you also spoke to the deputy chief of Boise Police about this. So tell us about that as well.
So Deputy Chief Tammany Brooks has some 26 years in law enforcement. We talked about how Boiseans will start noticing more cops on bikes along the Greenbelt and how they'll be shifting resources when necessary, school resource officers, for instance. We should also note that something like $800,000 in extra overtime for police is included in the next city budget. That's currently being worked on. Brooks said, yes, a shift of resources may be a response to public perception, but it's all about people feeling more safe. Other than that, he said, there was no way that he was going to respond to someone making political points. Let's listen.
I'm not going to speak to talking points that are made by our elected officials or get political in any way. My focus is really representing the dedicated men and women of the Boise Police Department who are committed to protecting our community, and we will continue doing that with everything in our power to keep Boise a safe place to live, work, and raise a family.
So, George, I think the next question then is about what happens next in all of this. When will the suspect, Ross Wardlaw, be in court next?
He is scheduled to be at the Ada County Jail. Ada County Courthouse. He is at the Ada County Jail right now, being held without bond. Again, he's set to appear in Ada County Court Monday, July 20th at 8:30 a.m. He is charged with first-degree murder, a reminder that a penalty could be life without parole or the death penalty. We can expect to hear a number of motions in that hearing on Monday, including the possibility of more mental evaluations, and his defense will likely argue whether he should continue to be held without bond. Meanwhile, at a vigil on the Greenbelt close to where Mr. Harbst was killed, his family told friends and those who are mourning the loss, quote, "We gather here to remind evil that the Greenbelt belongs to us."
Oh, just such a tragedy, George, but do appreciate that update. Lisa, let's head over to Eastern Idaho. There's a Pocatello nonprofit that was founded to support first responders It is now at the center of a very serious criminal allegations against its founder. And this is really raising some questions around accountability and transparency and even public trust. So, what do we know about these allegations that prosecutors have filed against, I believe his name is Samuel Farrell? And tell us where the criminal case stands right now.
Samuel Farrell actually founded the Rise and Respond Foundation that you just mentioned in Pocatello last fall. And just this spring in April, he has been charged with three pretty serious charges in Ada County. And I do want to preface this before I read those charges that he is innocent of the crimes until proven guilty in a court of law. But in April, Samuel Farrell was charged with sexual abuse of a child under 16. And second charge, knowingly distributing sexually explosive material of a child and providing false evidence along with another convicted child offender. And that was in Ada County. And he was in court 2 weeks ago on these charges. And East Idaho News has been following the case ever since.
So, Lisa, my understanding is that this is not the first time that Farrell's criminal history has come to light. So, walk us through how you pieced together his past convictions and then the timeline that led to this latest reporting.
Yes, it's kind of a crazy story because he did open up his foundation last October, and I did a story about the grand opening. I thought it was a good thing. And after that story ran, somebody tipped us off that he is a convicted sex offender, and we looked into it and we pulled his stories down. And we did talk to Mr. Farrell about it, and he told us that he thought he deserved a second chance and that he was going to write a letter of redemption to East Idaho News, apologizing to the community. And he never did that. Instead, 6 months later, these other charges came to light, which one of our readers actually let us know about. And that's how we got to this point with the story. And those other charges that he was in trouble for were actually in Twin Falls, where in 2011 he was investigated for passing bad checks in Costco and for having a relationship with a 14-year-old girl when he was 23 years old.
And Lisa, was he ever, you said he was charged, was he ever convicted of any of these charges?
It looks like he is a convicted sex offender in Twin Falls County, but he did get off on a plea deal with those particular charges, as my understanding.
Okay, so the leaders with Rise and Respond, talk to us about them, because Farrell apparently did step away from the organization, but the court testimony appears to tell a bit of a different story here. So talk to us about that.
Yes, it's very confusing because when we found out about these latest charges, we reached out to the foundation, and the people that are currently still in charge of the foundation told us and put in writing to us that Farrell had stepped down 6 months ago from the foundation. And I talked to Sam Farrell himself, and he sent me messages and verbally told me that he had stepped down from the foundation 6 months ago. However, we did obtain audio of his court hearing in Ada County 2 weeks ago, and the judge specifically asked him if he was employed. He said, "Yes, I am." And the judge said, "Where do you work?" And he said, "I am currently the director of the Rise and Respond Foundation." So my guess is that he's not being truthful to one of us. I don't know if he's not being truthful to me or if he's not being truthful to the judge, but he's got two different stories going on there.
So what questions then remain about his role with the foundation? I mean, has since this came out, where what he said to the judge, are folks at Rise and Respond changing their story at all about if he's still involved with the foundation?
I have not heard a word from anybody at Rise and Respond Foundation, but I have heard from Samuel Farrell himself numerous times, and he's also posted on social media numerous times that he is no longer with the foundation.
Lisa, I mean, this organization, I mean, it's a first responder organization, right? To help first responders. So I'm curious, what has the reaction been from the first responder community, but others who supported or even partnered with the organization?
Yeah, understandably, the community is pretty upset about it. We've had people reach out to us on Facebook and just different social media posts saying that it's giving a bad name to other legitimate. I'm not saying Rise and Respond is not legitimate. It may well be. I don't know, but it is making people angry that what his charges have given just, nonprofit organizations a bad name. And a lot of people that were connected with the foundation have wanted to be disavowed from being connected to it in any way.
And Lisa, where is this case now with Farrell? I mean, what are you watching for? Oh, does he have another court appearance coming up?
Yep, his next court appearance is in Ada County on July 30th. So that'll be interesting to hear what happens at that one.
Lisa, I want to turn now to a really big investment for Fort Hall. This is a new fire station that'll
Uh-huh.
open in Fort Hall, and this, I mean, this really marks a major investment in public safety, and a milestone for the Shoshone-Bannock tribes, but also the firefighters who serve
Mhm.
that community. Um, so talk to us about this because the grand opening included traditions like hose disconnect and push and truck ceremonies. But what do those moments represent for those firefighters, and why were they important to include all of that?
Yes, I actually got invited to that grand opening and got to witness all of the things that you just mentioned. And it was really touching, very exciting. It was a historic day in Fort Hall and for the Shoshone-Bannock tribes. But they did unveil their new $13 million fire station. And two of the traditions that you just mentioned, and I had never heard of these before, but they actually, instead of a traditional ribbon cutting, they stretched out the hose all the way across the
Oh,
six bays. And they had local dignitaries, from the state of Idaho and from the tribes there, and they all cut the hose, which was really kind of cool to see. And it actually symbolizes the transition from one facility to another, and that's what that hose cutting tradition means. And the other tradition that I thought was so cool to see is they push all of them pushed, like literally pushed with their muscles, this giant fire truck into the station. And it symbolizes putting the truck in a brand new home. And it was just a neat traditions to see, and it was very
mhm.
festive. The traditional Spring Creek drummers and singers were there, and lots of very touching and heartfelt speeches.
And this new station, we should note, has been years in the making. Lisa, how will it change the day-to-day operations, but also emergency response capabilities for the Fort Hall Fire
Yeah, the
Department?
fire chief touched on that, and it's just going to be so much better because number one, in their old facility, they didn't have enough room, and they had, equipment and people and stuff all over the place, and now everything's under one roof. They've got an 18, like I said, the six bays and 18 line personnel, and all of their equipment and all of their trucks and everything are all under one roof. And this is so nice that they can even have like community events, community gatherings and
Mm.
stuff in it. So not only is it a fire station, but it's a gathering place for the community.
Well, okay, so let's talk a little bit about that because the project was a partnership between the Shoshone-Bannock tribes and the federal government. So,
Uh-huh.
what have leaders from the tribes said about this new facility? I mean, what does it mean for the community beyond just better firefighting capabilities?
Yeah, like I said, they're able to have like community functions, open houses, different things like that. And you did mention where it was a joint venture that it was partially funded through tribal funds and federal support. And they had Congressman Mike Simpson actually showed up for it too. And the tribes presented him with a traditional Pendleton blanket and talked about how what a good relationship that they have with the state of Idaho and the tribes together to get this facility off the ground.
Lisa, 3 years after receiving a life-saving kidney transplant, a Blackfoot Native is using his second chance to advocate. So, can you talk a little bit about this? I mean, it's quite the remarkable story.
Yes, it is such a cool story. I just was really tickled that he reached out to us about this story. So the man's name is Adrian Ropp, and he is a native of Blackfoot, Idaho. He now lives in Utah. But 3 years ago, his kidneys were failing due to having diabetes, and I was a life or death situation where he needed a kidney transplant. And unfortunately, a Bannock County deputy was killed on a four-wheeler and he was an organ donor and was able to give Mr. Ropp his kidney. And had pretty good health since then. But since then, he was actually asked to be a part of this foundation, of the Kidney Foundation, to help advocate for people that need transplants or for overall kidney health. And he actually got to go testify on Capitol Hill at the end of June to talk to lawmakers about helping people with kidney disease get better health care and also to get better equipment and have access to better dialysis options and stuff in hospitals throughout the country. And he specifically narrowed in on Idaho and Utah lawmakers to help with this and just to represent his neck of the woods. And he's another cool thing about this guy is he is a artist for Disney and Warner Brothers, or has been anyway. So he's actually quite famous, but he's from Blackfoot and he's helping advocate for kidney patients in Idaho and across the country.
And Lisa, he told you that, kidney disease is not political. It's about people. So what changes is he hoping lawmakers will make it? And why does he believe that those proposals could really make such a difference for people?
One of them, and I don't fully understand this, but apparently kidney dialysis patients automatically are put on Medicare, I believe. But he believes that doesn't automatically cover all of their needs. And he's advocating for some of these patients to be able to keep their own insurance if it has better coverage for them. So that was one of the things that he was covering for. And also there's just new technology coming out on dialysis and different kidney treatments and stuff. And he's really advocating to try to get some sponsors to get some of this equipment put into the hospitals so that people have better access to kidney care that's supposedly supposed to improve life expectancy for many, many more years.
Well, Lisa, really appreciate all of your reporting. A lot going on over in Eastern Idaho this last week. Nicole, you just published an investigation that follows one patient's complications after a routine surgery, and then it expands into broader questions regarding patient safety and whether repeated warnings from hospital staff were taken seriously, and how one of Idaho's largest health systems responded when employees raised these concerns. So first, Nicole, thanks for taking time for us. Really appreciate it today.
Thanks for having me here, Gemma.
Okay, so can we start at the very beginning? What first led you down this path and thinking, there could be a story here?
Sure. So we were actually contacted by some of the whistleblowers from the story, and initially they shared just kind of some broad strokes of what they were encountering, that they felt that there was somebody who had previously worked at St. Alphonsus who had not been a very competent surgeon, and that when they had raised those concerns, they felt that leadership had kind of dismissed those concerns. And so from the outset, I was like, well, that sounds, not great. So the first time that I then spoke with them and sat down with them, I realized that they had recordings and they had documents and they had kind of a whole trove of additional information and other sources and other ways to really verify a lot of the information that they had brought up, as well as potential patients to speak to. As you mentioned, the story kind of follows a patient through his experience. And so then the possibility of a story started to become very real.
So Nicole, you mentioned the patient, Scott Teague. I hope I'm saying his last name right.
It is, yeah.
Okay, and so his story really anchors your investigation. Why was it important to tell this story really through his experience? And what stood out most to you as you were reporting this and working on this story?
Sure. So I was really grateful to Scott, obviously, for sharing his experience because it gave the story a face for the consequences of the allegations, right? Like, it was really important, and most of the story really goes into the concerns that Dr. Mark Shapiro's former coworkers had about him, and the claims that St. Alphonsus leadership knew about those concerns and ignored them. But more of us have been in Scott's position as patients, and more of us can kind of understand the impact of the story in that way than we can as healthcare workers. And so I thought it was important to be able to tell the story in a way that, more of our community and more people can really understand in that human aspect. And what stood out to me just about his experience was the lasting impression that this procedure had on him. He went in for a gallbladder removal, which is, one of the most common procedures that a person can have. and then ended up with gallstones and a bile leak. He had gallstones that were left behind in his abdomen, and he had sepsis and other complications that lasted for over a year. And it's been almost 4 years since that surgery, and he said that it still really affects how he gets healthcare, how he views healthcare. And so that stuck out to me about his experience.
And Nicole, one of the most striking things, at least to me, is that multiple employees told you that they repeatedly raised concerns over several years. What did those healthcare workers tell you about why they ultimately, decided to speak out publicly?
Yeah, so that's one thing that we wanted to make sure we were emphasizing in the story, that we had documents and we had recordings that made it clear that these concerns were in fact raised multiple times over an extended period of time. So you said over years. So the workers who spoke with me, they said that they felt an obligation to the community in the Treasure Valley, and they felt an obligation to patients, their former patients and any future patients, that they wanted to make sure people were aware that they had brought these allegations to leadership at the hospital, and they felt that leadership hadn't acted appropriately. So they wanted the public to know that there were people in leadership positions that, according to their allegations, that they said were not prioritizing patient safety.
And the story also raises questions really about hospital culture and whether employees actually feel safe reporting concerns. So, from your reporting, Nicole, what did you learn about that particular dynamic?
hmm Yeah, this kind of goes back to, with the previous question. I think that this is another thing that motivated the whistleblowers to speak up. I think that they had concerns that this was an ongoing or could be an ongoing culture at St. Alphonsus or at potentially other facilities, and they wanted to bring that issue to light so that it is less likely to persist. And then the people that I spoke with said that they started to feel, as they were reporting, they were hopeful at first that something would happen, that somebody would listen, and there were cases where things did seem to move along, but as those kind of concerns were dismissed or nothing changed, they felt that there were fewer and fewer avenues for them to really do anything. And so, yeah, I think there really was a sense of safety that was diminished. But I think it is worth noting still that those people continued to report on behalf of their patients
Hmm.
to a variety of leaders and in a variety of ways, even as this alleged retaliation against the healthcare workers was happening.
You even spoke with outside surgical experts to help evaluate what happened. Why was it important to include, those independent voices, right, rather than relying only on hospital employees and patients?
Yeah, so you're probably familiar with there's a saying in journalism that if your mother says she loves you, you should get another source. Um,
Yes.
and I had a professor, a journalism professor, who would always say that your second source shouldn't be your father because he would be biased. And
Yeah.
so in that context, I guess it sounds kind of silly, but the idea for us, right, is to remove any sort of possibility of subjectivity, make sure
Hmm.
that the information that you're getting is accurate. And so not only, I'm not a medical professional in any way, so I wanted a sanity check on what I was hearing from my sources and also what I was, reading as I'm
Hmm.
researching. And then I also just kind of wanted somebody whose emotions and their career and their health are totally separate from this entire situation that's obviously very complicated, so that they could take a look at what has allegedly happened and let me and let
Hmm.
our readers know, like, does this seem normal? What would you do in this position? And these are people who are very highly respected in surgery and in gastroenterology, and they were really lovely folks to talk to and very helpful to kind of give me some authority.
And St. Alphonsus, to be fair, says the patient safety is a top priority and that it does take concerns seriously. They also did cite privacy and legal obligations and declining to answer many specific questions. So, how did you approach, presenting both the allegations, but also the hospital's response fairly?
Right. So St. Alphonsus did offer us a statement, and that is included in full in the story, as well as paraphrased kind of throughout, as appropriate. And it was important to me, and it's always important to ensure that we're getting as complete a story as possible. So we knew that we needed to let St. Alphonsus have an opportunity to comment, to let them know that the allegations had been made and to ask for their
Hmm.
response. So that's also, it appears pretty early on in the story. So if anybody gets, it's a pretty long story, 3,500 words, I think. If anybody gets 500 words into the story and is like, I'm not doing this anymore. They've
Yeah,
already
that's a
gotten
lot
to
of
the St.
words.
Al's.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've already gotten to St. Al's statement. And so they are getting both sides of the story early on
Mm-hmm.
at that point. And we wanted to make sure that that was prioritized in that way. Um, but we also, we've got the recordings and documents that we were able to use to verify and kind of assert certain facts throughout. And we made sure that we were very clear about that. We made sure to kind of do the opposite as well and be very clear about when something was an allegation, when we didn't have another way to verify it. And I think that sort of lends um, another element of fairness to say, like, this is the most transparent view that we have of the story,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that that goes to being fair to St. Al's as well.
And you mentioned something at the very beginning of our conversation, and this is the fact that the story touches on something that a lot of us will go through, and that's becoming a patient, at some point. So what are you hoping that readers take away from this investigation? I mean, whether they receive care at St. Alphonsus or somewhere else.
Hmm. Yeah, so Scott Teague mentioned this to me actually, and the healthcare workers that I spoke with did as well. That a really powerful and a really useful thing when you're a patient is being an advocate or having an advocate.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, when you're sick, that can be difficult. So that could be a family member or a friend or somebody who's on your healthcare team, because health issues can be incredibly confusing and they can be scary. But they emphasized, that patients always have a right to ask questions about their care, and they always have a right to request a second opinion or a different provider if you have concerns. So I think that from a patient perspective, that was really important to hear because it can sometimes feel like, you're not the expert and you're not maybe allowed to question what's happening to you. But it was helpful to hear, and I know that that's something big that Scott took away from it was that he wanted
Mm-hmm.
to be more critical about what was happening and kind of how he was allowing care to happen to him, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So before I let you go, Nicole, I believe that you just only published this story in the last 24 hours or so. So what
Yeah.
kind of response, right? What kind of response have you received from readers, from healthcare workers? I mean, just the community in general.
Sure. I mean, the response has been really positive. It's been really well received. I've heard from healthcare workers and from readers who've said that they had, similar experiences, whether that's with a challenging work environment or with health issues, workplace concerns, and that, isn't necessarily, as we've mentioned before, like exclusive to St. Al's, but
Hmm.
people who said that it was helpful to hear that other folks have had similar experiences, that they were really glad to see that something like this was being talked about. So everything that I've heard so far has been really helpful. And I guess to that point, we pursued the story because we felt like the community needed to know about these claims, that they were really important allegations that were being made. And so I would just encourage anybody who has had a similar experience to please feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah, and I want to thank you for coming on because I know you've spent months on this story. So thank you for taking time for us today. And I
Thank
would
you for
also
having me.
encourage folks, absolutely, go to Idaho Statesman and read Nicole's full story if you really want the full picture of this. Yes, it's long, but it's worth it. So Nicole, again, thanks so much. So Lauren, you've been working on a really big story. More than 100 Idahoans have gotten sick. 11 people have actually been hospitalized. And state officials have identified 3 raw milk operations as they continue to investigate outbreaks that have been linked to unpasteurized milk. So raw milk, it has a really loyal following, not just in Idaho, across the country, with a lot of people, believing it's more natural, that it's healthier. At the same time, public health experts are warning about the risks of this. So, Lauren, you have been digging into this story. You've talked with farmers, you've talked with health officials, you've talked to food safety experts. So, can you first just bring us up to speed? What do we know as of today that we did not know when this investigation first became public?
So the short answer is we now know the names of the dairies involved. The Idaho Department of Health and Welfare first announced the outbreak and illness tied to people drinking raw milk in Idaho on June 3rd. They said they were investigating the dairies, that the dairies were cooperating, but they didn't name which farms these were. So something about this story just totally grabbed a hold of me from the moment it was dropped into the group chat, because like you said, it's tied to this trend that's happening all across the nation. So I started digging in. I went out to the small town farmers markets, talked to some of the farms, like you said, and I actually contacted the Department of Health again and said, I want to know the current case count. Just find out if the numbers were going up. And I was actually shocked when I got the numbers back for the end of June that they were ticking up. So we saw an increase from 60 people initially to over 111 people hospitalized. So once I found that out, I put in a records request for the names of the dairies. I told them by email I wanted to know the names. I said, this is a public health issue and people in Idaho deserve to know this information. They said the request slipped the system. I kept pushing them, and they said that they were going to release the names of the dairies, which they eventually did after we published the story.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, Lauren, how are these farms? What role are they playing in this investigation, if any?
So I haven't talked to the farms that have been named specifically since it's pretty fresh information. The Idaho Department of Health and Welfare said the farms are cooperating by giving milk samples. The initial press release said the farms were working with the department to, quote, identify and fix any potential sources of contamination. So I do plan to find out more when I talk to them next, as I plan to keep following the story. So just for our listeners, if they're curious, the three operations are Paradise Grove in Jefferson County, Lolita Farms in Kootenai County, and Evans Farmstead in Twin Falls County.
And as you mentioned, Lauren, those numbers keep ticking up. And we do know now that more than 100 people have gotten sick. Through your reporting, how unusual is an outbreak of this size, here in Idaho?
I think that's a really good question. And that's one I'm still trying to wrap my brain around, because campylobacteriosis on the low end is sort of just diarrhea that people tend to get from foodborne illness. So I have to find out how that relates in terms of how many cases we see a year versus what makes this different. But we know that it's different enough that the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare decided to put out a press release about it. And that means it's significant.
So tell us more about this bacteria. Like what kind of symptoms are people experiencing? And the reason why I'm asking this, and yes, it's lunchtime, is because 11 people have been hospitalized. So this isn't just a case of, I've got an upset stomach and I'm going to the bathroom a little bit more.
Right. So the illness is being investigated caused by the Campylobacter bacteria, which can be found in raw milk alongside E. coli, Salmonella, and Listeria. So symptoms of campylobacteriosis can range from diarrhea, which can sometimes be bloody, to fever, stomach cramps, nausea, and vomiting. So there can be some pretty serious health effects. I know that other outbreaks tied to raw milk have caused kidney problems, especially for children and people who are more vulnerable, like people with compromised immune systems and the elderly and pregnant people as well.
Well, one of the things that's really stood out in your reporting, Lauren, that folks need to know about is that Idaho does not require raw milk to be tested for pathogens before it's sold. So how does Idaho's approach compare with other states?
So today, 20 states explicitly prohibit interstate raw milk sales in some form, and 30 allow it, according to the FDA. States that allowed raw milk sales had nearly 4 times the outbreak rate compared to states where selling raw milk is banned. That's according to a recent study on dairy-borne illness that I cited in my study. So, and to add to that, people who consume raw dairy products were 29 times more likely to become sick, 14 more times more likely to die than those who didn't drink raw milk or eat raw cheese.
So, Lauren, I know you spent a lot of time talking with raw milk producers. What did they tell you about why they believe that, in selling raw milk and why they think customers keep coming back?
This is super interesting. I think this is where being an on-the-ground reporter really matters. I was blown away by the reasons because there were so many that seemed really out of left field for me. These farmers, this again was out in the small town of Kuski, Idaho. These farmers talked about food sovereignty, wanting to provide food products to their small local communities. But when I pressed them on why not just cook the milk and heat it up to get the bacteria and pathogens out, they went on about there being, quote, good bacteria being potentially cooked out by the pasteurization process. There were claims that raw milk had cured their lactose intolerance, that there were helpful enzymes in the milk, that these people had more energy. But these claims are anecdotal and they're not backed up by peer-reviewed scientific research.
So then on the flip side of this, you spoke with food safety experts. What did they say about the risks and why are they so concerned?
I spoke with Felicia Wu, a professor of food safety, toxicology, and risk assessment. She works at Michigan State University. She keeps up with all the food trends, and she talked about the history of pasteurization that came about in the late 1800s. People were getting tuberculosis all the time from drinking raw milk. And pasteurization, again, this comes from Louis Pasteur in France. It's just a name for heating up the milk to cook out the bacteria. So I think sometimes when people hear pasteurization, they think it's some complicated process or they're adding chemicals to the milk. And that's just not true. So her study, Felicia Wu's study, looked at dairy-borne disease in the US and specifically compared pasteurized and unpasteurized raw dairy products. And what was really interesting is the study that looked at 20 years of data between 2000 and 2020. Dairy-borne diseases cost the US more than $4 billion a year, with Campylobacter dominating milk-related outbreaks. They accounted for 71% of the costs, according to the research, 91.5% of the milk-related hospitalizations. And states, like we said earlier, that allowed raw milk sales had 4 times the outbreak rate compared to states where it's banned.
I have a little less than 3 minutes with you, so I want to ask you this. For people who have been drinking raw milk recently, what are health officials advising them to watch for? And when should they be seeking medical care, Lauren?
So if people develop some of the symptoms we talked about, bloody stools, nausea, fever, or stomach cramps after consuming raw milk or raw milk products, go to your doctor right away. Seek medical care rather than waiting to see if symptoms improve.
Mm-hmm. And beyond this specific outbreak, did your reporting uncover any bigger questions about how raw milk is regulated in our state?
I think there are more questions to be had. The Department of Agriculture is the one who actually licenses these farms. And so I need to talk to them next, and I'm going to keep digging into it. And I just wanted to add that this is a story that really shows us the power of local reporting. We're people who live in Idaho. We grew up here. We care about the people in our state, and we're going to keep pushing for answers.
And Lauren, are health officials expecting this case count to continue growing as they investigate?
I'm going to find out. That's my concern, is that if the case count is going up, what is the state doing about it? Are the legislators going to weigh in on this and do anything and adjust any of these rules if people keep getting sick? I think that's a really big question mark.
And with less than a minute left, for listeners who might be wondering, about the benefits outweighing the risks, what's the biggest takeaway from your reporting, boots on the ground, that you've done?
The purported benefits of drinking raw milk are make-believe and not based in science and fact. There is a huge risk in consuming raw milk, especially for children, pregnant women, the elderly, and people who are immunocompromised.
Well, Lauren, I really appreciate all of your reporting on this. I know you are continuing to follow this, so appreciate all of that reporting. And I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. George Prentice with Boise State Public Radio News, Lisa Leet with East Idaho News, Nicole Blanchard with the Idaho Statesman, and Lauren Patterson with Boise State Public Radio News. And thanks so much for listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. Do you have thoughts about today's episode? Make sure you email us at idahomatters@boisestate.edu or reach out on our socials. Know someone who might enjoy our podcast? Be sure to share it with them today.
Each story you hear on Planet Money starts with a question. What happens if we refund tariffs? Why are groceries so expensive? At NPR, we stand for your right to be curious, because the forces shaping our world can be hard to see. Follow NPR's Planet Money wherever you get your podcasts and start seeing how the economy really works.